You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So, this week what I'm going to be doing is talking about criticism in the sense of literary criticism and how you can apply that to, well, not just literary works, but pretty much everything. But I got 2 notes before I get into that. The first is, I recorded this essay while I was driving down to Springfield, which is about 40 minutes away from where I live, and back again because it was the only free time I could find to actually record the essay. As a consequence of that, the sound quality isn't quite as good as I hoped it would be. I had an essay that I recorded when I was driving in my vehicle up to Minnesota this last summer, and I thought the sound quality there worked out fine, but it wasn't quite as good in my wife's car. I'm not sure why, because they're both pretty high-quality vehicles. In fact, my wife's car actually drives smoother than mine, so I don't know why it worked out that way. As usual, I ran it through noise reduction and sound filters to clean it up a little bit, but I just wanted to come clean and say, hey, that's what's going on, but it was also the only quiet time I could find where I would be by myself driving. The second thing is, and I think this is only the second time I've ever done this on this podcast, I want to recommend a book to you for reading. This book is called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. It's by Joshua Swamidass, and especially if you're interested in issues regarding like creation, evolution, intelligent design and stuff, this is a book that you absolutely should read and consider. I'm only about 2/3 of the way through the book right now, but I highly, highly recommend it. It's well written in that you can follow his arguments and what he's trying to say, even if you're not an expert in these subject matters, and even if you're not ultra familiar with the literature on these subject matters. It's well evidenced in that he gives you good citations so you can go back and check his work. And it's organized in a way that I thought, at least, flowed very naturally, where he would bring up a point and I'd have an objection in my mind, and the very next section or the very next chapter, he'd be addressing the objection that came up in my mind. So that's all great. Now, his main point, which I think is very, very clever and interesting, is that he says when you look at the Genesis accounts and things like the genealogies that are presented in Genesis and elsewhere, those are ancestral genealogies, not genetic genealogies. Whereas when you look at what's often published in the scientific literature on like the genetic Adam and Eve and things like that, they're asking 2 different questions. And so he goes into some of the technical details on these things, but explains it in a way that I think the average educated person should be able to understand. But the point is, you have all kinds of genealogical ancestors who are genetic ghosts. That is, you have people who are your ancestors in the past in the sense that, like, maybe they were the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of your grandparents, but you might not actually have any of their genes present in your genome anymore because of how the selection process works when the sperm and the egg come together and some genes don't get passed on to the next generation and things like that. So there's all kinds of genealogical ancestors you have that are what he would term genetic ghosts, meaning you can't find any genetic evidence of them. Whereas when you read Genesis, it clearly is not talking about genetic ancestors. It's talking about genealogical ancestry. It's talking about those people who were your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-great-grandmother and so on and so forth. and not so much concerned with the genetics of it, because that's not what they were concerned with then. And so his main thesis is, when you take this into account, there really then isn't a reason why or at least, let me rephrase that. It's when you take that into account, it's entirely possible that there was a single human couple who lived even as recently as like 6,000 years ago, who could be the genealogical ancestors in that sense of every human being who's now alive. And the reason for that is that when you go back in time, the number of your ancestors multiplies every generation. So you've got 2 parents, you've got 4 grandparents, you've got 8 great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. The number keeps going up and up when you look backwards in time at your ancestors. But at the same time, the number of people who were alive in the world is actually growing smaller. So you keep getting more and more ancestors, and then you keep having less and less people, and eventually there's a convergence when you go back in time. And as far as how you go back in time, it's just, and where the convergence is, it's just kind of a math question at that point. And so, given the math of how that all works out, he's like, yeah, there could be a pair of human beings who are the genealogical but not the genetic ancestors of every person who's now living, and they could have lived as recently as 6,000 years ago. And he's had all kinds of scientists, even who are atheistic or agnostic, check onto this, and they're like, yeah, your math works. That could easily be the case. So, great book. I couldn't recommend it more highly, and as I said, I haven't finished it yet, and the fact that I haven't even finished it and I'm recommending it speaks to how great a book it is. But there are 2 or 3 caveats that I think come with this, which he readily acknowledges in the book. The first is, it probably would be impossible to actually prove this theory. By the very nature of the theory, he's arguing that there really wouldn't be evidence left of these 2 people, at least not in genetics, or not something that you could prove in any sense in the hard sciences. So it's kind of an unfalsifiable theory at that point. So, as I've said before, we should tend to be suspicious of unfalsifiable theories, so that's a check against it. The other thing his theory requires is that there were human beings, at least in some sense of human beings, living outside the Garden of Eden. That there were other human beings alive on Earth other than Adam and Eve. And as he acknowledges, and I do think this is the case, the vast majority of people who take the young Earth creationist position will absolutely never accept that as a proposition, that there were human beings alive outside of the Garden of Eden contemporaneously with Adam and Eve. Now, personally, I don't have a big problem with that. I'd say that seems possible. I don't think the biblical texts completely rule that out, especially if you take kind of like a functional view of Genesis in like a near ancient Eastern context, or like the view that the creation account was like God establishing some type of a temple on earth. Then the idea that there were human beings outside of the Garden of Eden makes perfect sense under some of those views, and I think those views are at least plausible. But clearly, I think what Swamidass is trying to do is trying to find a bridge between people who want to say Adam and Eve lived 6,000 years ago and the broader scientific community, which says human beings arose through evolutionary means, and he's trying to find a way to make them compatible. And in that case, I'd say, well, it seems like this theory is a step in that direction, because I think he's demonstrated in the broad sense of possibility that, yeah, these 2 things could, at least in theory, go together. But at the same time, practically speaking, I just don't think he's actually going to get 98-99% of young Earth creationists to buy into his theory, for the reasons that they're just never going to accept the requirement that there were people outside of the Garden of Eden. But anyhow, as I said, great book. Couldn't recommend it more highly. Get it, start reading it. It's very interesting, very well done, and has some good bits of data and evidence that I wasn't aware of that you should find compelling.
So I will dive right into the recording I did of me talking about various types of criticism while I was in the midst of driving to Springfield and back again.
I'm continuing on this episode talking about the philosophy of story and how we go about understanding and in some cases dissecting and deconstructing or even constructing stories. So in that vein, this week I'm going to talk about what's usually loosely termed as literary criticism, but it actually extends well beyond what you would normally classify as literature, books and great works of literature and art from people like Milton, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, things along those lines. You can apply pretty much all of these types of criticisms to literature like that, but you can also apply it to pretty much any other type of medium, whether you're talking films or video games or television, poetry, plays, and on you go. The only exception to that rule is if you're talking about genre criticism, where the criticism is particular to that genre. I think I remember mentioning before when I started this series that there are some things that work very, very well in a book that won't work very well in a movie, and vice versa, and you can apply that to all types of media. And even in that case, you can subdivide genre criticism down and see, like, we're only talking about books, but we're talking about criticism that is particular to novels. Another criticism that is particular to non-fiction books that are about history. Another one that's only particular to non-fiction self-help books, and you can go on and on and on. So broadly speaking, there's two reasons why I think this type of discussion is important, good, and useful. The first is that when criticism is done well, it's not just criticizing things in order to say that's what's wrong with them. Rather, when it's done well, what it is an attempt to look beneath the surface and see if there's some real depth to that particular thing that we're talking about. And that, again, applies across all mediums, books, movies, whatever. In fact, I think I'll mention this now. For the sake of ease, when I'm talking about the thing we're critiquing or criticizing, the book, the film, the movie, the video game, whatever, I'm just going to call it the text in this episode here. I'm going to do that because when you actually read and engage with critics on this subject matter, that's the terminology they use, and because it's just easier than continually saying the book, the film, the movie, whatever. So that's the first reason to do criticism, is it helps you look beneath the surface and see more of what's going on, understand more of the text, and maybe get more out of it. There's a lot of really, really good videos on YouTube, for example, that are looking deeply into, like, say, The Dark Knight, because that's a film that really has some real depth in it and seems to have something pretty substantial to say, and you can find people trying to engage with it in that way, where they're trying to say, well, is the point of the film about identity, where Bruce Wayne / Batman is struggling with his identity, and the Joker doesn't even seem to have an identity, and Harvey Dent starts off as a good guy and becomes the bad guy and is struggling with his identity, and becomes Two-Face, where he's got a split identity. And so that's a way of doing this type of criticism. That would be an example of formal criticism, and it's possible to learn some more things about the movie in that case, and see if it has some more depth and get something more out of it. The second reason to do this is because, as I'll get into at the end of this episode, a lot of the discussion that is now going on in American society in regards to social issues and politics has actually been very, very heavily influenced, and is in many sense the intellectual grandchildren of some of the ideas that were present in literary criticism about 40 or 50 years ago, as I've alluded to on some other podcasts. I'll try to go a little bit more in depth on it here. And so it's very, very relevant to kind of understand, well, what are the roots of what's going on here? Why is it that people talk all the time about speaking your truth and speaking my truth and things like that? Well, that is, at least in some sense, as I said, the intellectual grandchild of ideas that started in literary criticism and similar studies quite a while ago. So jumping right in, what is criticism in this sense? Well, as I said, it's an attempt to go deeper, and if you were to, like, say, look up types of criticism or types of literary criticism on the internet and get a list, you'd find all kinds of different kinds. Basically, for every type of ism or ideology or philosophy you can think of, there's a type of criticism attached to it. So you can have modernism or modernistic criticism. You can have postmodernism criticism, which I'm sure you've probably heard of to some degree. You can have colonialist and post-colonialist criticism. You can have structuralist criticism and post-structuralist criticism, feminism and post-feminist criticism. There's historical criticism, new historical criticism, genre criticism, psychological and sociological criticism, and many, many others. And even for those ones, you could say, apply a post to it as well, as in after or sans that. Say, you can do post or sans historical criticism, post or sans psychological criticism, and on you go. And even within some of these things, there's nuances available as well. So, for example, you can have first-wave feminist criticism, second-wave feminist criticism, or third-wave feminist criticism. And, yeah, there are key differences there, because, take me, for example, first-wave feminist criticism is actually pretty good and gives us a lot of good insights, I would say. But then I'm going to be highly, highly suspicious and skeptical about second and third wave feminism because I know a thing or two about what second and third wave feminism is. So basically, every single kind of philosophy, ideology, religion, whatever you can come up with, you can attach that as a type of criticism. So, since I've talked about media and how Christians need to get involved in media in the past, back in episode 33, how Christians should engage with culture. And actually, maybe I should have led the podcast with this, but that essay was recently published in a collection of essays called Philosophy of Religion and Art, so I'm very pleased that happened. Well, you could say that when I said Christians should engage with the media in such a way that they're looking for things to praise that are biblical-like teachings or things that we can say, that's a teaching that Christ would have made, whether it's as I argued in that essay, the father-son relationship in God of War, or the gender relationship in Mad Max Fury War. You could say that's me encouraging people to do a type of Christian or Christocentric criticism, where I'm saying Christians need to engage with media, looking for the elements that we want to praise and condemning the elements that we want to condemn. And so I hope if you're not familiar with this, if you didn't study any kind of literary criticism in college, that'll give you kind of an idea of how it's done. And it isn't just done strictly from ideology. Structuralist or formalist criticism, although they're technically different, but that's usually the idea of kind of looking in there, like what I talked about with The Dark Knight, where you're looking, well, what are the themes present? How do these characters work together? What maybe is the author trying to say without coming outright and saying it? What's the message here? And it's looking for the forms of the story, often in terms of archetypes or the structure of the story, that you think the author of that particular story or text is trying to communicate. And of course, you don't have to do this with just stories in the sense of fictional stories. You can apply this kind of stuff to nonfiction very, very easily as well. Now, in very, very broad senses, although some of my English and literary friends might disagree with me on this, I'm going to say that there's essentially two families of types of criticism in this regard. There's formal criticism, which tries to be objective, which tries to look at what the text actually says, and then there's reader response criticism, which is, well, what do you think about it? How does it make you feel? What did you like about it? What didn't you like as the reader, or as in a movie case, as the viewer of the film, or in the gameplay as a gamer who played it? What did you think about that game? How did the story make you feel? How did the mechanics work or not work for you? And it should be obvious that that's a very subjective type of response, whereas the formalism tries to be a much more objective type of response. Now, the reality is, because we're all subjective human beings, as soon as you do criticism of any kind, you bring your own subjective ideas and biases and ideas to bear on it. And so all criticism is really a bit of a mix of those two to some degree or other. But the ones in the more formal camp will try to be more tied into some kind of objective points, and the ones in the more reader response will be more subjective. So when somebody's saying, well, I just really didn't like that movie, that film, it didn't speak to me, I didn't enjoy it, that's a very subjective reader response type of criticism. And if I were to say something like, well, I really liked the way the camera angle hit this particular scene and how it zoomed in here to highlight what's going on in the story and how there's tension rising, so the camera's rising at the same, our viewpoint of the film is rising at the same time. Well, that's still my opinion, not me saying what I liked, but it's much more tied to something objective, something that you actually see in that particular film. Now, when you look at different disciplines, as far as how this stuff goes, this basic idea transcends different disciplines and even different genres, but it usually comes under different names. So, in English and literature studies, it usually is called literary criticism. If you go into biblical studies, this idea is usually called higher criticism. And I want to be careful to make a distinction here. There is a type of higher criticism which is associated with a, for lack of a better term, very liberal bent of biblical scholarship and theology that came out of Germany in, roughly speaking, the 19th century. But the term itself is a little broader than that. It's trying to do these types of criticism of Scripture and see, well, what, if anything, do we find when we go deeper? What was the author of John trying to communicate in the way he arranged the stories that Christ tells? Are they playing off of each other? In the Gospel of Mark, one of the things you find if you do criticism in this way is there's a thing that happens all over in Mark called the Markan sandwich, where Mark will start one story, and rather than finishing that, he'll then start another story, finish that story, and then go back and tell you the conclusion of the first story. And they call it a Markan sandwich because one story is sandwiched in between another. And so you might want to do this criticism and then think, well, what is Mark trying to say by the fact that he put these two stories together like this? And if you go into social studies, it's often called just critical theory in this case. And this is where you get kind of the ideas of critical race theory that everyone's now talking about so much. That idea of critical race theory does have its lineage way back in ideas of criticism that started in more in the humanities departments, for lack of a better term. The main distinction here when you're applying it to social studies is that those people are looking to apply these various theories to interactions that go on in the real world, to how we as human beings interact socially, the way we make laws, the way we form our culture, and things along those lines. Which I would argue probably does put it in a bit of a different category than simply saying, well, what was the author of this particular text trying to say that isn't quite on the surface? Well, when you analyze the way human beings interact and you say, well, let's look at their interaction and see what was the intended meaning behind the way they were interacting that they didn't come right out and say. Well, human beings certainly have that, but that's a bit of a different category than when you're analyzing any kind of a text. So, criticism in this sense, and I'll call it literary criticism just for the ease of speaking, but it again applies to anything that could be called a text, whether you're talking about a movie, a video game, a great work of literature, a poem, even a painting, in some sense, could qualify as a text in this regard. So what we're doing here, when we do literary criticism in this way of any text, of anything, is what you're doing is looking for pattern recognition. You're looking for patterns and seeing if the patterns you come up with make sense. Now, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you can even find patterns that weren't what the author intended, and many other things like that. But that's essentially what you're doing, is looking for patterns and then seeing, well, are there other patterns here than are what we see at the surface level? And what, if anything, can we learn from them about the author of the story, about ourselves, about life, and so on and so forth? Now, if you stop and think about it for a few minutes, or, well, even longer than a few minutes, but hopefully you'll get this in a few minutes, it should be immediately obvious that all communication that happens between people, even when it's just me talking to you on a podcast, you talking to somebody else, even just hand gestures and things like that, it's all in some sense based on pattern recognition. When I speak to you, you're recognizing the pattern of the words that I'm using, and that's delivering meaning and communication to you, because you've heard other people use those words before in different contexts, especially if you've been alive for a while, in all kinds of different contexts, and then you can understand, oh, that's what that word means, here's why it means that, here's what this next word means, and then you can understand what I'm trying to say. My daughter is 4 years old now, and she's continually asking me, what does this word mean, Dad? What does this word mean? Because she's hearing words, but she doesn't have the context to understand them, so the pattern recognition for those words is not kicking in yet today. If I remember, not kicking in yet. She actually asked me today what the word adorable means, and so I told her it meant something that's like beautiful, pleasant, or well-liked. I forget some of the other adjectives I used, because that's part of learning how to get by in the world, and one of the things children start doing is picking up on patterns and making use of them. That's the way basically all of language works. And you can take this pattern recognition deeper, and once you're looking at a text of any kind, film, movie, whatever, you can say, oh, that guy, he's the hero. And you recognize that because you're picking up on the patterns of the story and going, okay, that's the hero I'm supposed to root for. That's the villain I want to root against. These are the elements of the story, because if you've experienced a number of stories, you're going to pick up on those patterns. Now, a point that's inherent to this, which is something a lot of literary critics started to pick up on roughly 50 to 100 years ago, depending on how you want to date it, is that pattern recognition is dependent on your perception. And you can see that if, say, you've ever engaged with a text that's from a radically different culture where some of their patterns are very, very different. It didn't speak to you in the same way because you're not seeing the same patterns, because you don't have the same perception as that other culture does. And further, at least in some sense or other, you can actually, if you think about it, realize, well, that applies to pretty much everything you know and see in your life, because it's all dependent on your own perception. Right now, as you're listening to this, you're perceiving that you're listening to the Examine Life with Phil podcast episode. Well, you're not perceiving it with your eyes, you're perceiving it with your ears. Perceive means know in this sense, not just see. The knowledge you have that you're listening to me speak on this podcast is dependent on your perception. And that's why some literary critics, and I forget if it was Derrida who coined this term, or if he just picked it up from somebody else, will say that everything is a text, because you have to receive everything through your perceptions, through your mind, and as a consequence, you, at least in some sense, have to interpret everything that you perceive, which is, again, one of the reasons why you can have miscommunication, why somebody can like this one thing and you not like it, even though you both saw the same thing. Because in a certain sense, you both didn't see the same thing, because you see a movie that you really like, your friend sees it, well, you're both going to filter it through your perceptions. So say it's a movie about a person experiencing the trauma of war. Well, I'm a veteran, I've been to war. If you're somebody who's never been to war, you're going to perceive that differently than I did, and that will color your interpretation of that particular movie, just as my experiences are going to color my interpretation of that. Now, before you get all upset and I lose you, this doesn't mean what Derrida and many other people thought it meant, which is everything's open to interpretation, there is no objectivity. They took this point and ran with it way too far. Because that doesn't at all follow. The fact that we do all interpret things, it doesn't follow that there is no objective truth or anything crazy like that. It follows that we all interpret things, and sometimes we get it wrong, and sometimes we get it right. And I'll go more into this at the end. I just don't want to lose people as I'm laying out this problem. And this problem of perception, again, I say this to people all the time about so many things. I really wish people would just read philosophy, because the problem of perception is well known to philosophers. Plato talked about it, at least somewhat loosely, in his allegory of the cave. And roughly speaking, pretty much every major philosopher from Plato on at least tried to come up with some kind of a solution to it. Now, I'm not saying all their solutions worked. In fact, I'm pretty convinced that quite a few of their solutions didn't work. But pretty much all of them tried to come up with a solution. They were all very well aware of this problem. And so part of what happened, again, about 50, 100 years ago, with guys like Derrida, Deman, Foucault, and the name of the woman who came up with intertextuality escapes me at the moment, but she was one of the people who came up with this idea. What happened is they kind of thought they stumbled across or discovered the idea that, whoa, everything has to be interpreted. We thought before texts were authoritative, but they can't be authoritative if you have to interpret it and I have to interpret it, and we don't know what's objective about it. Therefore, everything's up in the air. Well, they weren't the first people to stumble across this. Philosophers had known this for a very, very long time and proposed many different possible solutions to this problem. So, maybe if these literary critics had actually read a little bit of philosophy, they'd have realized, oh, we're not quite as original as we thought. People have been aware of this problem for a long time, and they've found, or at least attempted to find, ways to deal with it. So, this was the great, or I would want to say, actually, not so great, although they think it was great, and a lot of people do think it was great, insight from the postmodernist and deconstructionist critics was that there are an infinite number, or nearly infinite number of ways to interpret any text, and that in broad senses, everything is a text because everything relies on your interpretation. And a lot of what you see playing out now in our politics and social issues in America is the intellectual grandchild of that idea. Now, if you're a reasonable thinking person, I think you should immediately be like, well, I think they maybe have a point there, but it doesn't follow that just because there are nearly infinite ways to interpret something, it doesn't follow that they're all equally good ways to interpret things. It doesn't follow that there isn't one correct way to interpret things. And if you think that way, you're thinking far better than many of these people were, because that's true. You can immediately narrow down interpretations by, well, what's coherent? That is, what fits together without inherent contradiction. You can immediately narrow it down even more by, say, what fits with the available evidence. So, in the case of Shakespeare, if somebody wanted to say, oh, here's a feminist way to critique it, you could go, well, no, feminism as you define it didn't exist in Shakespeare's time, so that doesn't fit with the evidence. And you can look for evidence internal in the text as well, and other things along those lines. There's actually a wealth of different evidence you could look for as far as, well, how do we make sense of these things? You could narrow it down even more, at least in some cases, by authorial intention. Now, in many cases, if you're talking about Shakespeare or Milton or something like that, the authors are long dead, so it's difficult to narrow down authorial intention. But if you're dealing with other texts, like the authors are physically present. When Derrida and de Man and Foucault were writing all these things, well, they were alive. So we could ask them, hey, what did you mean by this? And they would tell us their intention. And that's another good way to narrow it down. And there's a few other things we can do to help narrow down. And just as an example of how this can be done, I think we know pretty well that the author of the book Starship Troopers had radically different intentions than the director of the movie Starship Troopers. So the reason I'm bringing up Starship Troopers is, well, first of all, I do really enjoy the book. It's a book written by Robert E. Heinlein that's set in a very futuristic war about Starship Troopers, that is a military force that is in space, and you could be forgiven for looking at the title and the picture that you probably see on the front of the book and think, oh, it's just another sci-fi action-adventure series. But that's actually not what it is. It's a political treatise on how Heinlein thinks the military and he has some ideas on how the military and society should be organized, and he's disguised that as a sci-fi action-adventure series. It's actually a very, very political book in that it advances ideas like you should have basic human rights no matter what you do, but only people who've demonstrated awareness and commitment to the larger community should be the ones who have political authority. And so it's alluded to in the book that one way that you get the right to vote in that society is by volunteering for the military for a while. And it's alluded to that there's other ways as well. But the point I'm making here is there's a lot of very political and social ideas in that book about how Heinlein thinks how the military, the government, and society should work. And for the most part, it takes a fairly conservative or libertarian approach to a lot of these questions and issues. Now, the movie, on the other hand, I think Heinlein would have absolutely hated it. Now, if you're just looking at it as kind of a fun space action movie, it's a fine movie. I watched it again, I think, earlier this year, and it holds up fairly well as far as special effects and things like that, even though it's pushing 20 years old. And if that's all you're wanting to get out of it, it's fine. But the guy who directed it actually said that he wanted to have he actually said his point was that war will make fascists of us all, and he wanted to portray the government and society of Starship Troopers as a fascistic society. He put them all in Nazi-like uniforms. He deliberately did cues where there's like propaganda reels in there that are supposed to be mimicking the propaganda reels that the Nazis did. And so his whole take on it is, oh, Starship Troopers and the military, that's a fascist thing. It's terrible. And I'm probably oversimplifying it, but the point is, the author of the book had a very, very different message he wanted than the director of the movie. And the reason we can know that is, you can go read the book, you can read interviews where Heinlein talked about what he wanted to get out of the book. You can read other interviews where he talked about things like the military and society and realize the kind of ideas he had. And that there were the director of the movie version, Paul, I think his name is Verhoeven, actually gave interviews where he said, this is the goal that I have with this movie. So, I bring that up to counter the idea that, hey, since we all interpret everything, maybe you can't really know authorial intention. And now I know the people who would want to, the postmodernists, the deconstructionists who would want to say, well, you have to interpret everything, would want to say, well, but you're interpreting what Heinlein said about his authorial intention. You're interpreting what Verhoeven said about the message he intended for that movie, so aren't you falling back into that same trap? And this illustrates the problem that I'm pushing toward here, which is you're stuck in kind of the opposite of an infinite regress, where there is no cap, there's no limit to the theory. If you reject the ability to get an authorial intention, that means when the deconstructionist, the postmodernist, says that to me, I can't know their intention. I can't know that, or maybe to say it a little more fairly, I'm interpreting the intention of their words. I'm interpreting what they mean. And I would say right back to them, well, you mean something by what you're saying to me. You intend for me to take a meaning. Now, I can have good interpretations of what you mean, where I'm more or less syncing up, I'm understanding what you're saying, and I can have very, very bad interpretations of what you mean, where I'm very, very far off. If everything does have to be interpreted to the point, if everything is a text that has to be interpreted, and we only rely on our own perceptions, and there really is no way to get at what is the best interpretation, what's the objective fact that's there, what's the author intention, what's the author's intention, then we're just stuck, because I can't even take it very seriously when the postmodernist and deconstructionist says, aha, you can't know that author's intention, because I'm interpreting it when he says, aha, you can't know that author's intention, and how do I know I'm getting that right? And so that's the trouble that you run into when you take many of these criticisms that are like postmodernist criticism, post-structuralist criticism, post-racist criticism, feminist and post-feminist criticism, basically all the ists and isms and so on and so forth. When you take them sort of as kind of like a universal narrative, a universal way of criticizing, you typically wind up with this problem where there's no upper limit, where it ends up contradicting itself when you use only that type of criticism or only that type of interpretation all the time and in every way. So as an example of this, here's a quote from Douglas Groothuis on a couple of these ways of doing criticism that apply not only in literature but to the real world that I actually had used for a different essay of mine a long time ago. Groothuis says, and he's criticizing these people here, he says, to say that we know objective truth is to set up a meta-narrative that is intrinsically oppressive and exploitative. That's from John Francis Leotard. Various interpretive communities, Stanley Fish, determine their own truth. Text, whether religious or otherwise, do not have any fixed objective meaning. Therefore, they are neither true nor false in themselves. Jacques Derrida. Truth is what one's colleagues will let one get away with, from Richard Rorty. Or what power structures deem to be so, from Michel Foucault. Now, the problem, as I hope you can see here, is that we should just categorically dismiss these types of criticisms as a universal way of doing criticism, a universal way of looking at the world, or like a meta-narrative. Because these lines of criticisms, these ways of critiquing things, become incoherent as soon as we apply them to their own critics. These critics, like Foucault and Derrida and Rorty, intended us to take seriously the intentions they expressed in their own written text, and thus they undermine their own arguments simply by making them. If all meta-narratives are oppressive, then so is Leotard's. If no text has meaning, then neither do the texts of Derrida. If it's all about power structures, then so are the texts of Foucault. If truth is nothing more than what one's colleagues will let one get away with, then that's all it is for Rorty as well. And on we can go. So the point I'm driving at here is that when it comes to problems you see in excesses with critical methods, and this is especially true in the social sciences and things where it starts pushing into critical race theory and things like that, where they're trying to apply it to the real world, The problem comes not that there's no point, but in taking things too far. Go back to this problem of perception where, well, how can you really know what I mean? Well, communication can actually be pretty hard, at least at times. It can be very, very hard to know authorial intent of some texts, especially if the authors are dead or long dead or from a culture that we don't really have good access to. But it doesn't necessarily follow from that we can't know authorial intention all the time, or that language doesn't communicate. I'm pretty well convinced that if you're listening to my podcast, you've probably got a good idea of what I mean in when I'm giving you this podcast and most of the other episodes I do. Now, that doesn't mean it works all the time. Maybe I mess up and wasn't very clear. Maybe I use some terms and ideas you're not familiar with, so you have to go read up on them to understand what I'm saying. But if you're listening to this podcast and you've got a pretty good idea that, hey, Phil's talking about various different types of criticism in relation to talking about stories, well then, hey, communication worked. And likewise with Foucault saying that, hey, it's all about power games. Well, have text in the sense of literature, movies, television, and so on and so forth been used in various power games in societies? Oh, of course they have. But is that all that's going on? Well, of course not. There's more things involved with why an artist chooses this particular story instead of this particular story, why the director does this instead of this, and so on and so forth. You could make a claim that in the Starship Troopers example, that there was, at least to some extent, some type of power struggle going on in society there, where the director of the movie thought that the type of political philosophy the author of the book was trying to advance is wrong, and so he used his artistic expression in the movie to try to stand against that, and there's a power dynamic there. But is that all that was going on in the production of that movie? No, of course not. There was far more involved in why they chose to shoot this particular scene this way, why they modeled the ships to look this way, how they planned out this particular battle sequence, and things like that. To say it was all just power games is at best a gross overstatement. And so when you're looking at critical theories in relation to art and in relation to society, culture, and the real world, i.e. critical race theory, that's one of the things you need to keep in mind is a lot of these things actually do have a point behind it. People do use texts, whether of all kinds, to advance power games. There is racism in the world, and critical race theory at least says to look out for that. But it's when you view everything through that it becomes a real big problem. There's a lot more going on in texts we read than just power games and people trying to be oppressive. There's also people trying to fight back against what they perceive to be oppressive. There's people writing and doing art just because they love to do it. There's people writing and doing art for all kinds of other motivation besides power, some good, some ill. And likewise with critical race theory, the big problem with that is it views everything that could ever happen through the lens of race. It doesn't ever even consider anything else. Everything happens because some people are racist and some people are victims of racism. That's a very, very naive and stupid way to view the world. People do all kinds of good and bad things for all kinds of reasons. And same thing with how we're seeing and hearing so many people nowadays speaking about, well, did you speak your truth? I want to hear your truth. I'm going to make people listen to my truth and things like that. Well, that's tying back to this idea that all you have is your perception. So all you have is your truth. Any sense of the truth with a capital T, whatever that might be, well, we just can't get at that. And of course, again, that's a ridiculous overreaction. It is difficult to get at what's true sometimes. Your access to the truth is filtered through your perceptions. But it in no sense follows from any of that you can't get at the truth, that you can't be very, very certain your perceptions are telling you what is the truth. If you really, really doubt your perceptions are telling you what's true, you've got a big problem because you use them to get around in the world. I'm using them to, drive the car. I'm driving in as I'm recording this podcast right now. If I doubted my perceptions, I'd have a big problem because I'd be dead if they weren't showing me at least a pretty accurate picture of the world right now. So the point I was trying to get at is there's all types of criticism different types of criticism that can be applied to the world. Some of it is going to be a bit more on the subjective side, some of it's going to be a bit more on the objective side, and generally speaking, engaging in these types of criticism, as long as it's the appropriate type of criticism, can be a very, very good thing. It can help you learn a lot more about the text, whether it's a movie, book, game, whatever. It can really deepen your experience and help you appreciate good art a lot more and help you see the flaws in bad art and avoid it more. And the problems that come in pretty much only come when people take it too far, when they say this type of criticism is the only valid way to view these things, or something along those lines. And that error becomes much, much more pronounced when you apply it to the real world in things like critical theory and social studies and critical race theory. So anyhow, that's my podcast on criticism here. I hope you enjoyed that. In the future here, what I'm intending to do is get on some people to talk about various things like what makes a good book, what makes a good movie, what makes a good game, get some people who are experts or at least involved in philosophy to talk about those stories in those mediums. And then I'll do some breakdowns of some stories that I've really, really enjoyed in mediums like films and things like that. And that's where I'll go from here. So as always, I welcome your feedback. Write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com or look me up on the Facebook page, The Examined Life with Phil. And I'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode on Philosophy of Story. Thanks.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.